Yes, there is a section of the National Electrical Safety Code, or NESC, that addresses the proximity of overhead communication lines to power lines. NESC Section 226 outlines the requirements for overhead communication lines and their proximity to power lines. The purpose of this section is to reduce the risk of electrical hazards and interference between the two types of lines. The NESC requires that overhead communication lines be placed a certain distance away from power lines depending on the voltage of the power line. For example, for power lines with a voltage of 50 kV or less, the minimum separation distance is 2 feet. For power lines with a voltage greater than 50 kV, the minimum separation distance is 4 feet. The NESC also requires that overhead communication lines be placed in a manner that minimizes the risk of contact between the two types of lines. This includes installing the communication lines on a separate pole or structure, or using insulating materials to separate the two lines. The reason for these requirements is to reduce the risk of electrical hazards and interference between power lines and communication lines. If the two types of lines are placed too close together, there is a risk of electrical arcing, which can cause fires or other hazards. Additionally, if the communication lines are not properly insulated, there is a risk of interference between the two types of signals. In your case, it is likely that the cable television guy was referring to NESC Section 226 when stating that it was against code to move the cable television wire further away from the power line. However, it is important to note that the NESC is not a law, but rather a set of guidelines. Ultimately, it is the responsibility of the local utility company to determine whether or not it is safe to move the cable television wire further away from the power line. If you are concerned about the proximity of the cable television wire to the power line, you should contact your local utility company to discuss your concerns. They will be able to assess the situation and determine whether or not the wire needs to be moved. To provide a more comprehensive understanding, let's delve deeper into the specific requirements and considerations within NESC Section 226. The NESC, published by the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, or IEE, is a widely recognized standard for the safe installation, operation, and maintenance of electrical power and communication systems. It's important to reiterate that while the NESC is not a legal requirement in itself, it is often adopted or referenced by local, state, and federal regulations, making it a practical necessity for electrical and communication professionals. Section 226 specifically addresses the vertical and horizontal clearances between communication conductors and power conductors. These clearances are meticulously defined to prevent accidental contact and minimize the risk of induced voltages and electromagnetic interference. The specific clearance requirements depend on several factors, including firstly, the voltage of the power lines. Higher voltage lines necessitate greater clearances. Secondly, the type of communication line. Different types of communication cables, such as those used for telephone, cable television, or fiber optics, may have varying insulation properties and therefore different clearance requirements. Thirdly, the sag and movement of the conductors. The NESC takes into account the potential for conductors to sag or sway due to wind, ice, or temperature changes, and requires additional clearances to compensate for these movements. Fourthly, the presence of supporting structures. The clearances between conductors and poles, cross arms, or other supporting structures are also carefully regulated. In addition to clearance requirements, NESC Section 226 also addresses grounding and bonding of communication lines. Proper grounding and bonding are essential for minimizing the risk of electrical shock and preventing damage to communication equipment. The code specifies the types of grounding electrodes that are acceptable, as well as the methods for connecting communication cables to the grounding system. Furthermore, NESC Section 226 outlines requirements for the mechanical strength and construction of communication lines. This includes specifications for the size and type of conductors, the strength of supporting structures, and the methods for attaching conductors to insulators. These requirements are intended to ensure that communication lines are able to withstand the stresses of weather and other environmental factors. It's also important to note that NESC Section 226 is not the only part of the code that addresses the interaction between power and communication lines. Other sections of the NESC cover topics such as induced voltages, electromagnetic interference, and the coordination of protection systems. These sections work together to provide a comprehensive framework for ensuring the safe and reliable operation of both power and communication systems. When evaluating a situation involving the proximity of communication lines to power lines, it's crucial to consider all applicable requirements of the NESC, as well as any local regulations that may be in effect. This may involve consulting with qualified electrical engineers, communication technicians, or utility personnel to ensure that the installation meets all applicable safety standards. Now, let's address the specific concern about moving the cable television wire further away from the power line. While it might seem intuitive that increasing the distance between the two lines would reduce the risk of interference, this is not always the case. In some situations, moving the communication line could actually increase the risk of contact with other objects such as trees or buildings, or it could create other safety hazards. The cable television technician's refusal to move the wire likely stems from a combination of factors, including adherence to NESC guidelines, concerns about potential safety hazards, and the desire to maintain the integrity of the cable television system. It's important to remember that cable television systems are designed to operate within specific parameters, and moving the wire could affect signal quality or reliability. That is why it is important to engage the local utilities in your area. They are ultimately responsible to give guidance and provide any concerns they may have based on experience or from their regulations. To further illustrate the importance of following NESC guidelines, consider the potential consequences of neglecting these standards. Firstly, electrical shock. If communication lines come into contact with energized power lines, individuals who touch the communication lines could receive a potentially fatal electrical shock. Secondly, fires. Electrical arcing between power and communication lines can ignite nearby flammable materials, leading to fires. Thirdly, equipment damage. Induced voltages and electromagnetic interference can damage sensitive communication equipment, disrupting service and causing costly repairs. Fourthly, service outages. Contact between power and communication lines can cause widespread service outages affecting homes, businesses, and critical infrastructure. Fifthly, liability. Failure to comply with NESC guidelines can result in legal liability for property owners, contractors, and utility companies. In conclusion, while it's understandable to want to improve the aesthetics of your property by moving the cable television wire, it's essential to prioritize safety and adhere to established electrical codes and guidelines. Contacting your local utility company is the best way to address your concerns and ensure that any changes to the cable television wiring are made in a safe and compliant manner. They can assess the situation, provide guidance, and make recommendations based on their expertise and knowledge of local regulations. The NESC is updated regularly to reflect changes in technology and best practices. The IEE Standards Association publishes the NESC every few years, with revisions and updates to address new technologies, changing safety concerns, and lessons learned from past incidents. Staying current with the latest edition of the NESC is crucial for electrical and communication professionals to ensure that they are following the most up-to-date safety standards. Moreover, understanding the underlying principles behind the NESC requirements is essential for making informed decisions about electrical and communication installations. The code is not simply a set of rules to be memorized, but rather a comprehensive framework for managing risk and ensuring the safe and reliable operation of electrical systems. By understanding the rationale behind the code, professionals can better apply it to specific situations and make judgments that are both safe and practical. In addition to the NESC, other standards and regulations may also apply to overhead communication and power lines. These may include local building codes, utility company regulations, and federal regulations such as those issued by the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. It's important to be aware of all applicable standards and regulations and to ensure that any work on electrical or communication systems complies with these requirements. When planning any work involving overhead communication or power lines, it's always best to consult with qualified professionals who have experience with these types of installations. This may include electrical engineers, communication technicians, utility personnel, and licensed contractors. These professionals can assess the situation, provide guidance, and ensure that the work is performed safely and in compliance with all applicable standards and regulations. They can also help to identify potential hazards and develop strategies for mitigating these risks. In some cases, it may be necessary to obtain permits or approvals from local authorities before starting work on overhead communication or power lines. This is particularly true for projects that involve altering existing infrastructure or installing new equipment. Obtaining the necessary permits and approvals can help to ensure that the work is performed safely and in compliance with all applicable regulations. Ultimately, the safety of electrical and communication systems depends on the knowledge, skills, and diligence of the individuals who design, install, and maintain these systems. By following established codes and standards, consulting with qualified professionals, and taking appropriate precautions, we can minimize the risk of electrical hazards and ensure the safe and reliable operation of these essential infrastructure systems. In this specific scenario regarding the cable television wire, it's also worth considering the potential for future changes or upgrades to either the power lines or the communication lines. For example, the utility company may decide to upgrade the power lines to a higher voltage, which could necessitate changes to the clearance requirements for the communication lines. Similarly, the cable television company may decide to install new fiber optic cables, which could have different installation requirements than the existing coaxial cables. When planning any work involving overhead lines, it's important to consider the potential for future changes and to design the installation in a way that allows for flexibility and adaptability. This may involve using larger clearances than are currently required, or selecting materials and equipment that are compatible with a range of potential future upgrades. Another important consideration is the potential for environmental factors to affect the performance and safety of overhead lines. For example, strong winds can cause conductors to sway and come into contact with each other or with other objects. Ice and snow can add weight to conductors, causing them to sag or break. Lightning strikes can damage equipment and cause power surges that can damage communication equipment. When designing and installing overhead lines, it's important to take these environmental factors into account and to select materials and equipment that are able to withstand the stresses of the local climate. This may involve using stronger conductors, installing surge protectors, or implementing other measures to protect the lines from the effects of weather and other environmental factors. In addition to the technical aspects of overhead line design and installation, it's also important to consider the aesthetic impact of these lines on the surrounding environment. Overhead lines can be visually intrusive, and they can detract from the beauty of natural landscapes and urban environments. When planning new overhead line installations, it's important to consider the visual impact of these lines and to take steps to minimize their aesthetic impact. This may involve using less obtrusive structures, routing the lines along existing corridors, or burying the lines underground. Burying overhead lines underground is often the most effective way to minimize their aesthetic impact, but it can also be the most expensive and technically challenging option. Undergrounding lines may require extensive excavation, trenching, and backfilling, and it may be necessary to install specialized equipment such as underground transformers and duct banks. However, in some cases, the benefits of undergrounding lines may outweigh the costs, particularly in areas where aesthetics are a high priority. Finally, it's important to remember that the safety of overhead lines is a shared responsibility. Utility companies, communication providers, property owners, and the public all have a role to play in ensuring that these lines are operated safely and reliably. Utility companies and communication providers are responsible for designing, installing, and maintaining overhead lines in accordance with established codes and standards. Property owners are responsible for ensuring that trees and other vegetation on their property do not interfere with overhead lines. The public is responsible for reporting any potential hazards or safety concerns related to overhead lines. By working together, we can ensure that overhead lines continue to provide essential services safely and reliably for years to come. So, when you have concerns about overhead wires, always seek expert advice from your local utility.